And we are back in the book of Acts. Were last week, will be for several weeks yet ahead. 15th chapter, last few verses, and then the first part of the 16th chapter. Last week we were introduced to Silas and Judas, and they were good, strong Christian men from Jerusalem, and they were sent with Paul and Barnabas back to Antioch, delivering the letter that James and the apostles from the Jerusalem church had written, and saying that the Gentile Christians did not have to become Jews in order to be full-fledged Christians. And so when they got back to Antioch, they reported all of this and read the letter, and everybody rejoiced over that which was had taken place. And then Paul suggested to Barnabas that they go back to the churches that they had established and sort of strengthen them and see how they were doing and I guess carry the message from Jerusalem with them as well. Let me read from the 36th verse of the 15th chapter. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us return and visit the brethren in every city in which we proclaim the word of the Lord, and see how they are." Barnabas wanted to take John, called Mark, along with them also, but Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along, who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there occurred such a sharp disagreement that they separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and left, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. And he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Paul and Barnabas had been a team, and they had settled and set apart, had been set apart by the Antiochian church so that they could go and spread the news of Christ and the message of Christianity to other parts of the world. And so, like this said, Paul wanted to go back and visit those churches again and strengthen them and just see how the people were doing. And Barnabas wanted to take John Mark. John Mark was his nephew, I think, or cousin. I believe he was a cousin. And he wanted to take John Mark with him. And if you go back to the 13th chapter, the 13th verse says, "Now Paul and his companions put out to sea from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia. But John," that's John Mark now, "left them and returned to Jerusalem." So that's what Paul is talking about. He doesn't want to carry John Mark with them again because he had deserted them earlier. Now, we don't know why. We really don't know why John Mark went back. I've always sort of tried to give John Mark a little bit of the doubt, the benefit of the doubt, because he wrote the Gospel of Mark. And everybody says that he used Peter as his source. The source of his information came from the Apostle Peter. There are 2 books in the Bible written by Peter, but there is not a gospel according to Peter. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so Mark was this John Mark that Paul didn't want to travel with them on that second missionary journey. And I've always thought, well, maybe he was already starting to think that he needed a source to write this book that he wanted to write. And so he went to Jerusalem to consult with Peter before Peter left Jerusalem. Now, I don't know that. I mean, that's just speculation on my part, giving John Mark an excuse, I guess. But you know, they started out in Antioch. And when John Mark left on that first trip, he didn't go back to Antioch. It says he went to Jerusalem. And Peter was in Jerusalem. Now, I don't know. I just would rather give him the benefit of the doubt. I don't know. I really don't know why he left. Whatever the reason, it wasn't a good enough excuse for Paul to be satisfied in taking John Mark with them the second trip. I believe that the rift, if it was such, had already started between Barnabas and Paul, even before they started to go back. We looked last week when I was looking at this Jerusalem council thing at the second chapter of Galatians, where Paul talks about going back to Jerusalem and being there with the leaders about this thing. And again, from the second chapter of Galatians, this time a little bit lower, Peter had come to Antioch, verse 11. When Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was in the wrong. Before certain men came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Now, what's happened here, what Paul is talking about here in Galatians, is that a trip Peter had made to Antioch, and Peter was all right eating with the Gentiles and not observing the Jewish custom of separation, because Peter had gotten the vision of the sheet let down that led him to the household of Cornelius, which we talked about, who was the first Gentile convert to Christianity. And then, so Peter's in Antioch consorting with the Gentiles, and some Jews come from Jerusalem, reportedly here sent by James, and Peter begins to separate from the Gentiles so he won't offend these Jewish brethren that have come from Jerusalem. Now, when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. The other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. So I believe that Paul was already a little bit upset with Barnabas when this came about. And then when they wanted to go back, Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them again, and that was just too much for Paul. He just objected to the point that he and Barnabas parted company. Now, I really believe that it was best for all of them. I believe it was best for Barnabas, and I believe it was best for John Mark, and I believe it was best for Paul. John Mark, I don't know how old he was. We're not told that. But he was younger. He was a young man. But I believe that he needed the encouragement that Barnabas gave. Barnabas was called Barnabas because he was an encourager. And I believe John Mark probably needed that encouragement. And if he had gone with Paul, and Paul was, and I don't mean to be disparaging toward Paul, but Paul would have been a little more hard-nosed in his work ethics than Barnabas would have been, and I think John Mark probably needed that encouragement more than he needed the drill sergeant to keep him in line. And so I believe it was better for John Mark to be with Barnabas rather than with Barnabas and Paul, where Paul would have been the leader. Now, Barnabas went one direction, and Paul went another direction, and Paul took Silas with him, and Barnabas set sail for Cyprus. That was his home territory, and the churches were there that they had established to start with. In the book of Acts, though, we don't hear any more about Barnabas from that point on. Luke is writing the book of Acts, and Barnabas is out of the story, out of the history of the church as far as the book of Acts is concerned. I meant to mention this last week when they were at Jerusalem, at that Jerusalem council, and they were assembled there, and Peter stood up and recounted his meeting with Cornelius and the conversion of Cornelius to the Jews who were objecting to not being Jewish before you became a Christian. And Peter recounted his encounter with Cornelius. That's the last we hear of Peter in the book of Acts. Now we know that Peter wrote two books that are farther over in the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Peter, but that's the last that we hear of Peter in the book of Acts. And this is the last that we hear of Barnabas in the book of Acts. From here on out, we're talking about Paul and his experiences and his travels with Silas. Now, I don't know what Barnabas did. We'll just have to wait until we get up there and see Barnabas and say, well, where did you go from Cyprus? And he can recount his travels to us if he so desires. But we do know that somehow he made his way, or he was at least known to the Corinthians, because Paul in 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, 1 Corinthians 9, we ought to know this from memory because we took so long in 1 Corinthians, but 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, the 6th verse, Paul is talking about in the 9th chapter about his rights as an apostle. And let me just read this first verse. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And so he begins to defend his rights as an apostle. And he says, the other apostles, some of them have wives who believing wives, and they take their wives with them on their travels as they go from church to church. He says, I have that right. Don't I have that right as well? And then in verse 6, he says, or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? So somehow, and this was written a long time after this, because Paul had not even been to Corinth yet in his missionary journeys. Somehow the Corinthian church would have known who Barnabas was. So Barnabas continued his ministry some way, and then somehow he was known to the church at Corinth. And then there are two occasions in the New Testament where Paul talks about John Mark, and he wants Mark to come to where he is, and he wants the people to pay attention to the ministry of John Mark. And he says that John Mark is a useful servant and is much needed by me. And that's 2 Timothy 4:11, and Colossians, the 4th chapter, and the 11th verse. So these two men went in a different direction, but they still continued to serve and preach and teach and have an influence on the people as they traveled. Paul and Silas then start out on their journey, and they first visit Syria and Cilicia, and we believe that these are churches that Paul established before Barnabas found him and brought him to Antioch in the first place. And so this gave him an opportunity to go back and visit those churches, and he carried Silas with him. And then they go to Derbe and Lystra and Iconium. Anybody remember what happened in Derbe and Lystra and Iconium? I'm going to quit preaching if you don't remember. No. This is the place where when Paul healed a man, they thought he and Barnabas were the gods that had come down. And they were going to offer sacrifices to Barnabas and to Paul. And then later, the Jews came, and this is where Paul was stoned and dragged outside of the city and left for dead. And that's the first place he takes Silas to when they go back and start on their trips. I don't know whether he wanted Titus to have the experience, or the church apparently had been established there because they came back through that territory when they were coming on their way back to Antioch. But they go to Lystra and Derbe and Iconium. We meet Timothy. They stoned Paul, left him for dead. That's back in the 14th chapter, just a couple of sermons ago. Well, I guess that might have been before Christmas, because I took a break there for Christmas. You're excused from not remembering. That's been a while. They went back. We believe that Timothy and Eunice and Lois could possibly have been the ones who nursed Paul back to health after he had been stoned and dragged outside the city and left for dead. And I read from 2 Timothy where Paul is writing this final letter to Timothy. And he says, I thank God whom I serve as my forefathers did with a clear conscience, as night and day I constantly remember you in my prayers, recalling your tears. I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. I have been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. And we believe that when Paul was left for dead, that Timothy would have been there as a young teenager, and that's the tears that Paul remembers. They carried him back into the city, maybe to the home of Eunice and Lois. And Paul was there as they were nursing him to health. And Paul came back to life and revived. And there was Timothy with tears in his eyes because he had been watching Paul and saw the hurt and the pain that was put upon him. So Timothy is brought into the picture, and he becomes the companion of Paul and Silas, and Paul regards Timothy as his son in the gospel. We could look at this whole situation, and we could focus on the division